Okay, we're going live.
From across the world, from Japan to China to India to Latin America, very important Latin American list shaping up in the book series, and so on. It's a really crucial intervention in Marxist literature and in making Marxist theory available. That really hasn't been on this scale since the 1970s. So we'd like you to look at the book series, individual volumes, perhaps take up the author of the book club that Haymarket is promoting, and also, of course, again, if you're part of an institution, to get your institution to buy as many volumes as possible. Those are the two key elements of our activity, aside from the conferences, the journal and the book series. And we think it would be, it's essential basically for us, for our existence, for us to be able to continue to thrive, for those to expand. So please subscribe to the journal, buy the books in the book series, publicize both around you, and help us build the historical materialism project.
Welcome, everyone. It's a real pleasure to welcome everyone to this Historical Materialism Conference online session on Himani Bannerji's book, The Ideological Condition, Selected Essays on History, Race, and Gender. The author herself is now holding up the paperback copy. And as you will have learned from the introductory video, this book in its paperback version is now available for 40% off from Haymarket Books and will be for the next week or so as the HM conference online continues. As always, on behalf of all of our participants today, I want to thank Historical Materialism Journal, our premier journal of critical Marxist research, which also, in addition to publishing an outstanding journal, continues to host vital and important sessions like the one we're having today. I'm David McNally. I teach history at the University of Houston, where I also direct the project on race and capitalism, and I'm an editor of Spectre magazine. I'll be making some opening comments, but first I want to tell you a little bit about the format for our session. Needless to say, we're exploring, investigating, riffing upon, and celebrating Himani Bannerji's brilliant collection of selected essays written over several decades of reflection and development of the project of an anti-racist feminist Marxism. And we're going to be discussing aspects of the book with myself and two other interlocutors, Judy Whitehead, who received a PhD in social anthropology from the University of Toronto in 1984. For the past 15 years, Judy says she has been researching primitive accumulation in the neoliberal era in several regions, mainly India, but also Central America, and with plans for ongoing research in sub-Saharan Africa. Judy's research has focused on understanding the ways in which capitalism and imperialism produce class and race identities of the propertied and the propertyless. Now, Judy didn't say so, but I will, that an excellent introduction to some of this deep thinking she has been doing around race, class, and primitive accumulation is her book, Development and Displacement in the Narmada Valley. After I say some introductory things and turn it over to Judy, we will then hear from Kanishka Gunawardena. Kanishka works at the University of Toronto, where he teaches geography and planning from a Marxist perspective. He says that he attends HM conferences regularly, but I will add that he has dozens and dozens of just literally outstanding essays, articles, book chapters, and so on to be found. Some of the most recent are in historical materialism, human geography, and new formations. After I say a few opening words and I turn it over to Judy and Kanishka, then we will hear from the author herself. Himani Bannerji is an accomplished poet and an anti-racist Marxist feminist scholar and professor emeritus in sociology at York University, Toronto. Among her scores of published works is the book we are celebrating today, which, as I said, brings together decades of writing to be found in journals and books published in India, Canada, Great Britain, and beyond. And finally, we are privileged to have this really wonderful selection of them brought together by H.M. Brill and now in paper by Haymarket. The Ideological Condition, selected essays on history, race, and gender, is also distinguished for being shortlisted for this year's Deutscher Memorial Award. Now, as I said, the Ideological Condition brings together work that Himani Bannerji has done over many decades. And these are essays and articles that have decisively shaped the thinking of hundreds upon hundreds of scholars and activists literally around the world. And I count myself among those fortunate enough to have come under the influence of the Bannerji effect. The Bannerji effect is much more widespread than many people recognize, but I think this volume is essential to really spreading it. There are scores and scores of people working on problems of Marxist feminism, racial capitalism, social reproduction theory, and more, who will deeply, deeply benefit. People who have been concerned about nationalism and fundamentalism, the ways in which they're reshaping the world in which we live. People who are dedicated to Fanon's project of stretching Marxism to fit the colonial situation are going to find deep reflections in this work. And I think what really distinguishes Himani Bannerji's work for so many of us is that she has resisted what she refers to as aggregative theory, That is to say, the idea that we can simply add together separate and discrete phenomena called class, gender, race, sexuality, ethnicity, national identity, and so on, that if we only add enough bits and pieces together, we can arrive at a composite picture. And Himani's work is distinguished in all of its registers by developing what she calls a relational and integrative analysis, one in which we don't need to add together because the so-called pieces are already co-constituted. That is to say, for Himani Bannerji, there is no class that then needs to be inflected by anti-racist analysis. It needs to be reflected on by anti-racist analysis, but race is already constitutive of class, as is gender. And as she puts it in one of, I think, her really sharpest and clearest and most provocative formulations, she argues that critical social theory of the sort that she wants to develop conducts, quote, a relational and integrative analysis, which needs a deconstructive method to display the process of mediation. It can both take apart and put back together in a non-aggregative fashion an event or an experience within a wider context by using a materialist theory of consciousness, culture, and politics, unquote. I want to really just highlight two dimensions of that passage. First, what I've already alluded to, the non-aggregative approach, the non-additive approach. You don't need to add together what is already combined. In fact, we instead need to think through the dynamics of that combination: race, gender, class, sexuality, national belonging and identity. And in a less highly charged theoretical idiom, Himani puts it in another essay: race cannot be disarticulated from class any more than milk can be separated from coffee once they are mixed, or the body separated from consciousness in a living person. So while there are different registers in which and through which we experience phenomena, this does not mean that they were ever detached, separated from one another, any more than milk and coffee can be once they are mixed. But I want to draw attention, secondly, to Himani's insistence on the inseparability of consciousness, culture, and politics. The analysis that she develops across these works is highly attentive to the cultural registers in which race, class, gender, nationality, and so on are lived. Himani recognizes that we don't live these at, quote, purely political or purely economic levels, that everyday life is saturated with these social relations, and that therefore understanding them in the ways in which they are lived, produced, and reproduced in everyday experiences is vital. As a result, despite this deep attentiveness to culture, she resists a kind of culturalism which autonomizes ideological and cultural relationships and phenomena. She insists really on their irreducible unity in the way in which they are lived. I think there are many, many influences in Himani's thinking in this regard, but the work is a pure original. She draws on Gramsci. She draws on her teacher and mentor, Dorothy Smith, particularly with respect to the concept of experience. And she draws on Bertolt Brecht, who I think recurs in all kinds of ways, most notably with respect to the idea that ideological and cultural phenomena need to be studied as processes of production, not as reified artifacts, not as finished products, but as actual acts in which human beings are producing social relations of domination and resistance, and in which race, class, and gender are being lived. The other thing I would say before drawing my comments to a conclusion and turning it over to our other interlocutors is that this project of attending to the specificities by which ideological, political, cultural, social phenomena are produced in our lives and in our societies is not about a suspicion of universalism. What Himani Bannerji's work is doing is very close to the kind of practice that Aimé Césaire advocates in his discourse on colonialism, which is to say, it's searching for a universalism that is steeped in specificity. It's not an abstract or bad universalism. This is a universalism which cannot be impatient with difference, that needs to work through the ways in which universal practices, including those of emancipation, need to attend deeply to all of the particularities through which the social relations in our lives are shaped and produced. In this respect, of course, Himani Bannerji is also, I think, in the spirit not simply of Marx's universalism, but also that of Fanon, to whom she gestures, but also to Tagore, who she discusses at length in this book. This is a universalism that cannot yet arrive. It cannot yet arrive because there is work to do. And that is the work of freeing our world of violence and oppression, of overcoming the relations of domination, the residues that are deeply inscribed in all social practices by which oppressive relations of difference come to mark people's lives. This is the ideological condition. The ideological condition, which is one, as the subtitle says, of history, race, and gender. And what Himani Bannerji tracks for us is a way of thinking through and beyond the ideological condition so as to open up and reclaim the space of emancipatory theory and practice. And that commitment to changing the world is ever present in these essays. You cannot read the discussions of fascism, fundamentalism, and gender violence and not sense the urgency of the writing that is in play here. This is a recasting of whole areas of Marxist theory and practice in order to be adequate to our times, times that speak to the urgency of global transformations. And this is a time I would suggest in which we need this book, The Ideological Condition, and its author, Himani Bannerji, to continue to speak to and help us find a way through coping with, both at levels of theory and practice, the project of world transformation. That is what I mean when I refer to the Bannerji effect. So with those opening comments, I will now turn it over to Judy Whitehead.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for coming here to celebrate Himani's new book. I'm very impressed with the breadth and depth of this collection of her writings, all of which, as David said, coalesce around the theme of the ideological condition, how it is produced, and most importantly, she offers us a grounded relational method that can resuscitate both our social sciences and politics on a less ideological basis. It awakens us to the possibility of a sociology of knowledge grounded in social relations that cuts through the multiplex of constructed, abstracted, and reified categories that form the relations of ruling. In this, I believe it follows the method of Marx, who moved from the abstract categories of value and surplus value that appeared to and did dominate capitalist societies to the concrete social relations that produced such reified, abstracted forms. As David mentioned, it also draws upon Dorothy Smith's institutional ethnographies. Himani adds to and transforms these impressive pre-existing sociologies by introducing the concept, social relations, and practices of imperialism and race making without making racism a product of ideology and culture alone, but a part of social relations of domination and hegemony. Since Himani's work transcends so many dualisms, I hope you will allow me a minute of memory and memorialization. I first met Himani briefly in 1979, long time ago, in Toronto, and then followed up with a 1980 visit in Calcutta. Between these two visits, I arrived at India's JNU, participated in a worker peasant demonstration of over 1 million, met some extraordinary people, and was involved in student politics of the communist variety. Entering Himani's home in Calcutta in late 1980, I did not know that I was to be parachuted into one of the intellectual nerve centers of India's left cultures. I experienced wonderful out-of sessions on Bengali theater and politics. And I have to say that this made Toronto's leftist enclave seem very small and parochial indeed. I was deeply impressed by this experience. But when I returned to Toronto in the mid-1980s, actually this experience marked me. This was a period in which Himani's early writings on everyday common sense racism were produced. And I remember well the rejection and humiliation that even I experienced when I tried to express to fellow academics what I had learned from India's left culture. A number of feminist scholars only want to talk about Daridas, while many of my colleagues viewed me with disdain, or at best pity, for my impressively bad judgment in going native. No wonder I at first celebrated Said's Orientalism, despite its culturalist and binary epistemologies, because he gave us some words to name the confusion, bewilderment, and anxiety experienced through subtle and not so subtle rejection by the gatekeepers of academic institutions. Today, such unconscious Orientalist attitudes will make most intellectuals cringe with embarrassment. At least I hope so. But at the time, they played a very large role in delegitimizing, warping, and de-skilling Canada's skilled immigrant applicants, a process which unbelievably still often occurs today. There's a group of Iranian doctors in Vancouver who have complained that they're not getting their certification over decades. Another way of saying this is that many fellow Canadians have undergone similar kinds of distortion and othering to the experiences that Himani analyzed so ably in the 1980s. She often said at the time, identity politics by itself is insufficient, but without it, in other words, without a positive identity, there is nothing, I guess, except depression and futility, or a kind of mimic existence. Unlike some intellectuals who shifted wholeheartedly into post-colonial studies, Himani did not. Her discussion of Weber's Oriental ideological category of tradition go beyond Saidian analyses by addressing the social relations of this knowledge production. Here I find one of her clearest discussions of the ideological condition, the epistemological process of creating a dehistoricizing and dehistoricized body of content, and which simultaneously a way of erasing and distorting that content. The production of the notion of race or the Orient as types of fixating second-level cultural forms serve as examples of ideology. Okay, so moving on to the 1990s, we had the twin phenomena of neoliberal expansion through intensified corporate trade agreements on the one hand. On the other hand, the politics of opposition to imperialist globalization in South Asia and other regions was often hijacked by religious right-wing movements which opposed Western liberal culture, but reached happy accommodations with metropolitan finance capital. This new conjuncture required a return to class and gender analysis with an attention based on social relations of property and propriety. Himani's impressive work on the women's question within imperialism and nationalism accounted for a lot of her output during this decade. I'm proud to have been a part of this endeavor, but my interests have moved on. My attention has been focused on primitive accumulation globally in the neoliberal era, attention to relations of property versus non-property, and the way these divisions have been racialized. Himani's work, again, has much to offer me, a brilliant analysis of racialized sexual harassment in the matter of X, plus her 2016 article, Patriarchy in the Age of Accumulation, which explicitly links sexual violence to the social relations and political formations that primitive accumulation requires. In the matter of X has haunted me for a decade because it challenges me to understand in new ways how violence, class, and racism are imbricated in contemporary relations of ruling. In this work, I believe Bannerji is a predecessor of current racial capitalist studies, which are revealing to us the other side of capitalism's history, slavery, settler colonialism, and the dispossessions therein, and the fact that imperialism has been an integral part of capitalism since its inception. And I'd also mention here the recent work of Prabhat and Utsa Patnaik. These studies lead me to examine legal assemblages of property relations, particularly to land in India and Central America, and hopefully to other regions of the world. I have also been aided by Brenna Bonder's work on racialized property regimes and various discussions of William Petty and John Locke's early role in constructing a legal zone of difference overlaid over formal legal equality. This legal zone of difference was defined as privatized settled farming versus assumed non-privatized methods, often assumed to be unproductive. This legal assemblage has spread throughout much of the world through first British and then American imperialism. It is reflected in contemporary jurisprudence, such as the World Bank's land titling programs, Israel's expansion into Palestinian territories, and Canadian court judgments on First Nations lands. And I have to say that some of these legal and policy documents that I have been reading could have been taken verbatim from Locke's second treatise. And that was written in 1690. So it seems we haven't moved on from there. If the commodity, value, and private property are the germ cells of capitalism, denoting the formal equality of property owners, then the real inequality of the propertied versus propertyless is defined by a racialized series of supposed non-productivity and non-privatized land possession, usually yoked together in law. By focusing on the social relations of primitive accumulation, I can say with some certainty that the drug wars of Central America are not major drivers of migration. The major source of migration experienced in Central America is the widespread dispossessions of land through these titling programs and the violent repression against those who protest. Hence, Himani's method illuminated so strikingly in her article in the matter of X has facilitated a path out of one of the many instances of the ideological condition, at least as it relates to Central American migration. Okay, so I ended with a question, but I saw that David had already sort of asked and answered it. But I was wondering if Himani could elaborate on her discussion of intersectionality and whether that is a kind of reified concept that is a dead end for socialists, and basically some discussion on what concepts we can use instead. Thank you.
Thank you, Judy. Kanishka, we'd love to hear your reflections on the ideological condition, and then we're going to hear from the author herself.
Okay, great. Thanks, David. Thanks, Judy, for those thoughts. I have to say that, I actually first heard of Himani when I was a graduate student in Ithaca, New York at Cornell University, in the mid-1990s. I went to the local bookstore and, for some good fortune, I pulled this out of the shelf. It's called Thinking Through Essays on Feminism, Marxism, and Anti-Racism, Himani Bannerji. I pulled this out and I was just standing in the store and started reading, without noticing that, okay, I'm just stuck to my feet, just like, engrossed in this book. And I was simply blown away, particularly by this essay called But Who Speaks for Us, right? And I immediately felt that I was one of, I'm included in that us, in some way, and so as I was blown away, but I was also a little bit surprised and dismayed in a way, because, I was wondering why had not anybody mentioned Himani Bannerji to me? I was already in my third or fourth year in a PhD program, supposedly studying critical theory and things like that. In the company of, famous Marxists and so on. But so this, kind of stuck with me, although, I had no idea at the time that, 10 years later, I would come and, move into a house, few doors down the road from Himani's house, here in Toronto, right? So I have a, not merely a, political and intellectual relationship, but also a neighborly personal relationship. So I obviously cannot be very objective in my reflections, on Himani, But I would, so I'm going to offer something a little bit different, perhaps, or at least in a different way, from the two presentations that you heard. But I would like to start, with some empirical facts, so objective facts, let's say, so this is a big book, and it feels very solid, and it is nearly 800 pages, right? And it has 31 chapters, two of which are wonderful interviews with Himani, and it is divided into 6 parts. The first part called Ideology and the Social, second, Ideology and History, and the first part, of course, includes some really classic essays, such as, there's one essay called Ideology, which is a brilliant, examination or the theorization of the notion of ideology by going to the texts of Marx himself. And it also includes the essay that blew me away when I first read it, But Who Speaks for Us, which I will come back to in a minute. And the second section, Ideology and History, so including chapters such as, the notes on James Mill's historiography of the history of British India, and the part 2. Part 2 is making of a subject, gender, race, and class. Part 3, nation, multiculturalism, identity, and community. Part 4, ideology, nationalism, gender, and politics. Part 5, culture, class representation, and finally decolonization. So I'm not going to kind of read the whole table of contents, but I just wanted to give you a sense of the vast sweep, of Himani's work here. So it, and also, these essays range from, the earliest essays were, I think, written in the mid 80s to late 80s. And so there's a kind of a 33, like over 3 decades of work is represented in this collection. And they take us, so the collection is also a record of an incredible political and intellectual itinerary, a biography. So so we follow an inimitable and a unique, thinker, who was, who comes from India, from Bengal, Calcutta, where she grew up there, in the company of great intellectuals. Her brother is one of the leading brilliant economists in India, Sukumar Chakravarti. And she was, incredibly well trained. Also, I think by people like Yashodhara Bagchi, a pioneering feminist intellectual in India, and grew in the company of some of the famous Indian Marxist political economists, such as Omio Bagchi and others. So she comes with this, but she herself, I think her first passion was in literature, right? She's an artist, right? And by temperament and her way of expression. So she came to the University of Toronto to study English and started writing a dissertation on Coleridge, right? And and she writes in that essay that I mentioned, But Who Speaks for Us? The sense of alienation, exclusion, and dismissal, that she experienced, as a student, in this kind of, University of Toronto English department, right? And how these experiences actually led her to, give up English. She says in this, to quote a sentence from memory, I didn't need English, English didn't need me, right? Under these circumstances. So she left this English PhD and started working with Dorothy Smith, the great Canadian Marxist feminist, and started, entered in some way, not officially, but the discipline of sociology, right? And so this, although she shifted to sociology, I think the artist, the literary, literature, like the writer, never left her, right? So there's in her work, I think the ideology, of course, is a fundamental category in this throughout her work. But as a Marxist thinker, intellectual, and a writer, I think there's a really interesting and insightful concept that enables much of her theoretical and political work. And this, I think, is the concept of the social. And what is really interesting is the way she approaches it and theorizes it, right? And it also explains some of the things that, how David explained, Himani's approach to, things like race, gender, and class, how they co-constitute each other. So the social is approached as an ensemble of relations, right? And going back to Marx himself here, and as a, as also social practice, right? And so in the Marxist kind of tradition, or if you think of it a little bit in more philosophical terms, I think, maybe there's a relationship to the way Himani approaches the notion of the social to the, Hegelian Marxist or Spinozist Althuserian kind of concept of totality, right? But but for her, it is a little bit different. It's not such an abstract philosophical concept, but it is an embodied, lived, experienced idea, the social practice. So it has something to do with the body, with consciousness, and to what somebody like Henri Lefebvre would have called everyday life, right? So it is a capacity to kind of bring the body, the lived experience, consciousness, what Gramsci calls common sense, and all of that, in conjunction with the more abstract, universal, political, economic state structures, into very kind of a nuanced and comprehensive notion of the social, that, in my view, enables her to write the way she does. So I think that's a kind of a theoretical, conceptual contribution that she has made to Marxism, in addition to all the pioneering work she has done for in the areas of anti-racist and feminist scholarship, especially in Canada, because when she came to Toronto, the anti-racist feminist discourses were not what they were after 2 years of contributions from Himani, right? So she changed the discourse and gave a generation and more people language and a vocabulary to talk about politics, by bringing these kinds of things together in a meaningful and politically radical way, right? So there's a lot more to be said, of course, but I think my 10 minutes are up. So so Himani asked me to leave her with a couple of questions. So I will oblige. So one of the questions I have is, what has always fascinated me about Himani is that she has been active politically in two spaces, in India and in Canada, right? So one question that I have is, how do you kind of live in both of these places at the same time, right? So for you, like, everything is connected, is an ensemble, right? But how do you kind of relate these two spaces in your work, right? And the last question, or the second question, is a very simple but also maybe a big question, but I'll ask it anyway. So what kind of Marxist are you? Right? I'll leave it there. Yeah.
Thank you, Kanishka. Before I turn it over to our author, let me just remind people that the Ideological Condition, now in its beautiful paperback version, which I do not have here, I have only the hardback version. Now it is being held up by the author, and I will let her hold it up again once I turn it over to her to make sure that we get it on camera. But the paperback version is now available 40% off during the course of the HM Online Conference from Haymarket Books. So don't wait, don't hesitate. It is now the time to get it. I will say, for instance, just yesterday, I had some wonderful comrades from Brazil contact me to say, can you get us in touch with Himani Bannerji? We would like to translate her essay, Building from Marx, and publish it in a very prestigious journal here in Brazil. And by the way, I think a few of those comrades are watching today. So now is the time, folks. This is not just the Bannerji effect. This is the Bannerji moment. And do track down Haymarket Books and take advantage of that 40% off. Now, it is an utter delight, a complete pleasure, and an honor to introduce my friend and comrade, Himani Bannerji.
I don't know what to say. I'm happy, overwhelmed, and humbled by the fact that you have all taken me seriously and spoken about things I've written, because I've really never thought about them as any particular thing, as of any value of that kind, and continue to feel very unread, very unprepared, and actually not even a properly developed academic. And the reason why this book is so thick also has a lot to do with what you have all said, which is that I wrote always for rather small publications, some of which presses have disappeared. There were women of color presses, like our women's presses, and my presses and my publishers were no more socially and politically, culturally entitled than I was. And the other thing I want to say is that I didn't think of myself as an academic mainly because the university, after I was born in it, in family connections, but after a while I quit. I finished a PhD, halfway through a PhD on Coleridge. I gave it up because, as I said, English didn't need me and I didn't need English. But what did I do? For 18 years, I was a piecework academic. I taught part-time piecework at York, wrote in these rather small, insignificant, and very early perished and perishable journals, and there really was no place for me or space for me to work with, at least in the world of printing and what was called the established Marxist world at that time. So this book, its appearance, its discussion, it really all surprises me and pleases me, but it's still a little unreal to me that it should all have become so meaningful to people. Had I not lived to be 79 almost as I am, perhaps this wouldn't have happened. So thank God for long life. But also thank God for my meeting with David, because if I hadn't met David, who showed not just friendship, but really an appreciative comradeship towards me, I wouldn't have taken what I'm doing seriously to that extent, because, I mean, Kanishka read and liked it, but I didn't know Kanishka. There must be a lot of people who read and liked my work, but I didn't know them. I wasn't in a place where they could know me. But I was in a picket line with David, where I saw him regularly in dark glasses, and I thought I would cast him in a mafia movie because he, in very dark glasses, looked extremely impressive as a kind of a mafia labor leader. So David and I became very good friends and comrades and so on. And because I valued David's work so much, the fact that he valued mine meant a lot to me. And as Dorothy said, there is nothing so nice as being admired by people whom you admire. And Dorothy is the other person who said to me, you've got what it takes, you've given up English, but who cares? You do what you want. And I said, what will you, how can I? And she said, oh, Oisy will let you. And I said, how? I want to do Marx, I want to do literature, I want to do communist politics. And she said, we will. And I said, what will you call me? And she called it, and she smiled in a very strange way and said, you will be an offshoot of Paulo Freire. We will call it an informal education thesis, class, as in everyday life. So all these conjunctures, meeting of people over my life, and I'm being realistic and truthful, really gave me some motivation to go on the Canadian end, while in the end, that is in Canada, in 50 years I've lived in Canada, maybe more than 45 of them I went to India for half the time. And it's my friends and comrades and the Communist Party of India, CPIM, my fellow traveler relationship with them, the urgency with which they were, looking for questions, answers. And in the last early decades of 20th century, under the attack of Hindu nationalist right, they were floundering, they were losing, and whole world of questions opened up. Not is what is to be done, but what is it that we didn't do along with what we can do. So my work, which is both in English and in Bengali, and it is in that way schizophrenic in linguistic terms. I write in Bengali and use Bengali for my English writing and vice versa. But they became, they're really twins of each other. And of course, as to answer Kanishka's question, I'm afraid the world is not so uniquely different. It's specifically different, but generally of a piece with global capitalism and development of imperialism for the last 200, 300, 400 years. So there's nothing I find there in terms of larger social relations and politics that are not connected to the world I live in Canada. If not race, then caste, shades of race as well, for example, gender all pervasively, sexuality as an issue are as much a problem in India. And class I see as a being kind of existential ambience of all of this. And I don't mean class in the sense of status, in feudal status, power, and hierarchy relation, but in the capitalist sense of the class, where modes of oppression are embedded in the modes of exploitation, which is inner to the process of capitalist production. In that, capitalism seems to have been so different from feudalism. But in the case of India, the mixture of oppression and feudal forms and capitalist forms led to massive debates around issues, around Asiatic mode of production. In the 80s, there was a huge debate around Asiatic mode of production. People that Kanishka mentioned and Judy mentioned, we were then readers of those people. And then there was earlier another great set of essays edited by Rodney Hilton on the transition debate, which we all read then too. And so I would say that all of this, which was being taught to Judy at UFT and Kanishka was probably learning in Cornell or years later, were all part of our legacy at that time. And I couldn't therefore say my here is not there or my there is not here. It's like that. It's like class. I can say they're specific, but I can say that they're constitutive, they are formative, and yet with very particular features to them. The history of the places where capital and colonialism entered is really as significant in the alteration of that space and capital itself as capital's standard features with which capitalism and imperialism went from Europe to rest of the world. And so Frantz Fanon was really one of the people, not only Amilcar Cabral was really very important for me, Aimé Césaire, later on Tagore, and various other writers really gave me a kind of a one world outlook, which is international, but not necessarily cosmopolitan. I think there's a difference between the two. So having said that, I want to actually move out into talking about one thing about this big book, is that the title of the book is Ideological Condition. And the ideological condition sounds a little bit like original sin. You can't quite get out of it. But in capitalism, it is an original sin. And historical materialism, the kind of knowledge necessary for creating of capitalism, the mediational institutional structures, categories with which capital operates at all levels, social, cultural, political, and financial, economic, are all categories that are actually ideological categories which standardize and hold reified forever until something major revolutionary happens, how capital operates and reproduces itself. So just as kind of one molecule of the human body reproduces the genomic structure of the whole body, you might say that every molecule of this society in which we live reproduces the molecule that goes into the whole. But equally, I want to say that this organization of capital is both agonistic and antagonistic. That is, that when I think of somebody like Marx's idea of practical consciousness, and I think a notion much underused by people, which of course he doesn't develop that much either, maybe perhaps indirectly in his critique of commodity fetishism and things like that. There is a kind of a feeling that daily through practice in everyday world of capital, riven with contradiction and riven with conflict and power forms of difference, people acquired a form of getting by knowledge, which much later Gramsci came to call common sense, and which has been much used as well. I think this is a prefiguration of that kind of notion. It's not purely good because it's popular. It's not ideal because it comes from below, because the below itself is made with lots of elements from above. And the ideological components of making of capital penetrate that society. And with our lives, we reproduce capital, the state also of capital that combines with capitalism to create the power structure within which, we breathe without even thinking of anything as our normalcy. So I think that practical consciousness is a very important notion. And Marx says, and I think Marx is absolutely right on, that whereas all ideology involves elements of ideas, not all ideas are ideological. I mean, this is something that my defense committee in the English department asked me to explain, that I had to explain why I call the conservative ideology of Samuel Taylor Coleridge, etc. Because, I mean, I didn't know much except reading a little Marx and Williams then. I came up with this idea that, yes, all ideology is a form of ideas, but ideas are not in and of themselves all ideology. And it took the rest of my life to separate out these kinds of meanings, their applications and practices. And I think in some way Gramsci's sorting out the good sense out of the practical sense of common sense really is amount to the work that the communist organizer does in persuading, which used to be called propagandizing, in agitating towards that kind of recognition which allows for class consciousness and allows for class struggle to happen. While the reverse, the parts that have been ideologically influenced go into being supportive and being annexed by the ideological apparatus of the state, to quote Althusser, what Dorothy called the ruling relations of the state made out of ruling categories. So the society that we live in and our lives are multifaceted. They're, let us say, friendly, agonistic, unfriendly, and antagonistic. And it's in that fissure, in that fight, then the future can arise. And I have to also mention at this point then, what on earth why on earth is ideology something different or separate, and what other forms of knowledge did Marx talk about? And I think that in not only German ideology, but later in his critique of Adam Smith and various other people that he thought, like his critique of Adam Smith, who thought primitive accumulation is something good people did by thrift and savings, and kind of entrenched it as a kind of good rich and bad poor, the lazy poor and the hardworking rich and all that, is an ideological critique that Marx performed. And in these when did this arise? And I think Marx is right in saying that it arose when mental and manual division of labor came to such separation that while expertise from the mental division of labor was practically connected to development of technology, science, etc., but also that developed a kind of relative autonomy of the mental division of labor, which became, it pretended to itself, and others were convinced, that it was an objective, arbitrative, socially transcendent form of knowledge, which classical sociology taught us and anthropology taught us. And from the heart of that, people came who were administrators of British colonialism in India, who were major linguists and administrators at the same time, like William Jones, James Mill, Henry Sumner Maine, and of course someone who never came to India but defined India, namely Max Muller. So when you look at, he said you could only be objective by being far away from India. So he wrote an article called What is India? And defined the content of this India. And India became an ideological category for the rule of the company. Whenever you said India, both the company and subsequent government actually knew what the content was to be that of these people. The stereotypes were. It was a constellation of stereotypes that Said very, I would say, very meticulously outlined, but he never really quite worked out where this comes from. But to my mind, then ideology is sort of inevitable in the capitalist condition. And this is the great tool of legitimacy and hegemony from which we suffer, we add to, and we are kind of ruled, and which we resist with what the third kind of knowledge, that of historical materialism or critique, which was called science by Marx, within quote, because science did not mean mechanical knowledge or technological productive force of that kind alone. It was a productive force of a high order, but what he meant by it is the fact of critique, ability to look at what is common sense, what is ideology, and make the ideological critique. And the biggest kind of thing that puts a hitch in the work of ideology, or two things. One is history, and one is social organization and relations. Whenever you see ideological exercise of a category, which is not necessarily in itself so, like class. I mean, class has been used extremely ideologically by stopping all conversation, by reifying all knowledges that we can have. And yet class has also been melted into a flow in which all these social relations and ideas have joined in to go. So this critique is the science of revolution that Marx talked about. And in the end, I think that he actually, therefore, also left us with the good news that theory cannot only be answer to theory. One legitimation theory cannot be simply answered by another legitimation theory. Legitimation of communism and socialism in theory does not fight capital also except in theory. So the resolution of all these theoretical events happens to be in the practice, in organizing, in mobilizing, in struggle. And what that is going to be is not going to be the same thing everywhere, speaking historically and socially. It will address the main relations of capital as a whole, but it will also be very specific to the history of those countries where capital is operating. It will have as much input from the penetrated society as the society that is penetrating it, and culture and economy. So that is about all I have to say. And only one other category that might be of interest that I think to you, which is in my article called Building from Marx. And there's the notion of the concrete as a kind of taken really from Hegel, as a kind of convergence of many determinations. And determinations here mean multiple social relations, but it also means historical, not so residual, but active elements still form, helping the new capitalist mode to form. So determinations, as Marx said, people make history, but not as they please, but with multiple determinations in which they are thrown in, born, without any choice, anywhere in society. And those determinations that were there before us will have to be taken into account for a really active, practical communist revolution to occur. So determinations, mediations, and concreteness are very, very signally important for us. We have to catch a phenomenon in the moving. We have to catch the phenomenon in the living. And that's what I tried to do in the essay that tried my best, but still language is very serialized. It's not a novel. It was actually a case submitted to the tribunal of workmen's compensation. When I tried to show how it is in the making, how race is in the making, class is in the making, gender, and actually space, where industrial capitalist spaces had no room whatsoever for a Black woman to be operating a forklift. And she should have been somewhere doing some manual thing. She should have been doing something that a beast of burden does. Angela Davis points out that Black women are sexed, not gendered, in meaning in this kind of way. So then it just makes a lot of sense to me to fall back upon literature. Literature is very polyvalent, polymorphic, and it's as class happens all at once, does not happen serially. Literature is the only mode, or painting or music, in which we can speak always all at once about everything. But given that our trade doesn't prompt us to go beyond a linear form of expression, I think the most we can do is thick descriptions of these moments of making. And that's about all that I have to say, and thank you.
Thank you, Himani. And I know that our audience will join me in wanting to really applaud the rich and thoughtful introduction, really, to the thinking that runs through your book here, the selection of essays we have. And I'm reminded that Kanishka quoted the title of your earlier book, Thinking Through. And that's one of the things I would say is really distinctive, is that you're thinking through with your readers. And one can feel the thought process as the process of reflection and critique as much as arriving at the conclusions. So the process of critical thought is on display. Now, just so everyone in the audience knows, we're going to have about 20 or 25 minutes of further discussion. You are free to put questions into the chat. They will be forwarded to me, and I will read them out so that everyone can hear them, and so that Himani in particular might have an opportunity to reply to them. I will start off that discussion while people are collecting their thoughts and say to you, Himani, there's been, I think, a growing literature really interested in the production of difference. And it seems to me that in all kinds of ways, this is something that you've been thinking about and thinking through for a very long time. And yet, as you were saying with your final remarks there about a unity of multiple determinations, the multiple registers and relations through which classes lived and so on, you have been very attentive to the production of difference, but you've thought about it in terms of a systemic production, if I could put it in those ways, rather than there being ontologically separate sites from which differences are produced. And so I'm just wondering if you can just think a little bit and talk to us a little bit about how you would address that whole question of the production of difference in terms of what you were just saying earlier about the unity of many determinations.
Well, hard question as ever. But a very necessary one, and in a way it adds to what Judy asked about my response to intersectionality, which is also a question about difference. Now, I don't have the last word on it. I'm very confused as is, how to put it all together. But I would say that ontology, if it is considered as a kind of a knowledge of being, right? We are not talking about ontology or being in the Heideggerian sense, right? In midair, as it were, as a kind of individualized contentless consciousness of being me, right? So I would say that ontology in that sense doesn't really make much sense to me, because all ontology for me is social ontology. And social ontology begins with the birth of a little baby, her social being thrown into her mother's and father's arms, and everything else that follows from day one is received and reworked in the mind of that little one, through her experience of the world. So ontology, the social and experiential, are inseparable. And nor can we draw boundaries of the social. I've always been really quite confused about use of philosophy in social theory, because the notion of totality, for example, I don't know if something can become something else if it's already full and total, which is so perfect, which has got this ring that really is fully formed. So then I think, well, the social is not total. The social is not countable. The social is at the level of unconscious and conscious. And I have not made a kind of an accountancy ledger book of what is the social and what goes into it. So what I feel that in this whole situation, then, being social means being so many things at once, and they're not coherent, and nor are you aware at times, which is why psychoanalysis to me is important. What all goes into this kind of social, what arousals and associations are possible, or what even like Bakhtin's talk about the dialogical imagination that is implied in the social. So I just think that I can't quite come to a unitary theory of any of this. In fact, not even a theory. For me, simply the process is one of investigation, which creates certain kind of identities, I suppose, in the sense that it is felt, experienced, and named. And without a name, people don't have any agency. Subjects have names, and they, under those names, do what they do, but doesn't mean that the subject has only one name. I mean, I'm a feminist and I see that as my identity, Marxist, that too is an identity. But I'm also I was born in a Bengali Indian family. I could say that's my identity. Whatever name I'm summoned under, and whatever is politically at that time the most powerful, will grab my identity or become my identity. I was accidentally born Hindu. And now I'm being summoned by the right-wing Hindu nationalists to become active under that name, right? But I could be equally summoned by the communists, by feminists, and so on. So birth and belonging kind of identity, and the hard work of acquiring identity that we all have done here. You have, I have, others have. That is identity we earned. And that was the identity of our constantly becoming, even now in old age, for me. And I think that we can't really go on without addressing that as a kind of dynamic and changing and phenomenon. And the other is, so therefore, intersectionality, to my way of thinking, is actually signaling to that. Where something but not has been named and become actionable. I wasn't surprised that it was named in the time of, during a court case. And I did my work in the time of X in the court case too, that these three things, some of which are legislated, others which are not, then have to push the boundaries of law for bourgeois liberal law, but good bourgeois liberal law, to push the boundary of law as far as it can. So for me, intersectionality is useful, but what it is mobilized or activated by, a socialist project or a reactionary project, is what makes it what it is. And right now it has a good use in liberal project, in the good sense of the word liberal.
Thank you, Himani. Our viewers are being incredibly hands-off and respectful of us. I'm not picking up any questions in the chat. So Judy and Kanishka, I'm going to let either of you come in for a minute each, either of comments or questions back to Himani, if there's anything you'd like to pursue here. If not, that's fine, but I'm going to open it up to either of you. Kanishka, you look like you might be ready to come in with a thought or a question for Himani Bannerji.
Sure. Thanks, David. So I want to, I would like to hear a little bit more actually from Himani about the conception of the social, because, I suggested, I think that maybe it is in some way comparable to the notion of totality in certain versions of Marxism. But I didn't mean by that suggestion to say that totality means something that is total and complete and fixed. So there are, of course, within the Marxist tradition, notions of totality, for example, from Sartre, and others, and Raymond Williams, that have a much more kind of a open-ended, and also Lefebvre, open-ended and dynamic and contested and contradictory, notions of totality. But I think what Himani's approach to the social adds to some of these more sometimes abstract, notions of totality, even though it is dynamic and, and so on, is the lived experience of it, of the social, right? That it has something to do with, it is material, it has something to do with the body, it has something to do with consciousness, so common sense, everyday life. All of these things come together in the way that Himani mobilizes this notion of the social, right? And of course she is also able to, I think, bring into all of these essays in the book, her own experiences, as well as the experiences of many of her readers, such as myself. And this is what, makes, her such a influential and dear, teacher, for generations of people who have encountered her. So I think, the notion of the social is something that that has really, grabbed my attention, when I read Himani's work. And I would also add again that, there's the writer's sensibility, right? The novel, like, she could be a novelist, and she is a poet, and so there's this ability to kind of look at life as a whole, like in terms of, so there's a sense of, real people, real experiences are involved, and are at stake, in all of these essays, so this is something I think makes extremely readable, for somebody in my line of work, where we have to read all kinds of academic stuff, that is not always an act of pleasure, so.
Thank you, Kanishka. Judy, do you want any quick follow-up on that?
No, I don't have much problem with because I'm a social anthropologist, I think I can kind of feel my way through what Himani's talking about. We don't often use quantitative concepts, or and we have to do a long period of living with the people that we're writing about. So experience comes in there too, personal experience. So even though anthropology was born out of colonialism, we have to take, it does have an experiential element in which, the discussion of social relations is important, although, in the culturalist phase, this has sort of been taken over by symbolic elements, language, divorced from social relations. I just have one thing to add, which is personal, but since this book has just sort of shown me the whole trajectory and the breadth of Himani's interest and her history, and it's just really well put together. So I would like to commend David and Haymarket Press, but I'd also like to add one more biographical moment, which is that, and I think it shows that the person and the professor, the kind of humanity we see in Himani as a professor and writer, is there in her personal life also, because I actually believe that she and Michael saved my life in the 1980s. So, because I was self-medicating about some of these difficult experiences I was having. So thank you. I have a huge amount of gratitude that you have been in my life.
Well, I just want to cry, that's all. Have a good cry and also a long coffee with all of you. That's what's needed. And what can I say? I mean, I don't like talking, maybe because it's the person who loves literature in me doesn't like things that don't have images associated with them. So I don't quite get philosophical abstractions like totality. I don't know when something is total. I know when something feels full, when I feel wholly humiliated, wholly happy, as much as my mind can grasp it. But I don't really know when a form is itself, when a form is complete. Because the way, going back to an old poem, 16th century poem by a Sufi poet in India, there's this poem which says, how many gods have died, in these aeons to come, that in the aeons that is past, but there is no beginning and end to you. Like waves, they rise from you and disappear back into the waves. And it's that crest of the wave, when the wave is kind of caught by, like surfers are waiting for that moment of cresting. That may be something, we call that it's so fully itself social then. But it's always such a melting moment. It's the same body of water rising and falling. And it brings me again back to Marx's incredible imagination when he talks about we only start from real life. I mean, this real life is messy, crazy, unbounded. When is it's total? When has it reached? We always know there are fractures and openings and craziness, and out of that something happens. Dorothy calls it as a fissure. Your experience rips open and you don't know where it is, which bit of you is involved in it. So, I have that problem because I don't quite know. I'm such a believer in movement of things, having lived in 3 continents and seeing myself being the same and being different, being the wave and being the water. I will end with literature of this Sufi poet. So I don't know when I have peaked or crested.
Well, that's almost a beautiful concluding note. I'm aware that we do have a few more minutes. So going back to what Himani just said as a starting point, I think I will share with our viewers that there's a sense in which what Himani just said sounds very simple. It's not so simple when one tries to translate it into prose, because and this is something that I think, Kanishka, you were hinting at, and Judy, you had opened with earlier. In the work that Himani does for us as a writer, there is a sense in which what Marx calls practical human activity is what is foundational to all of her reflections and her explorations. But as I say, that's a lot easier said than done. To actually not trivialize practical human activity, to be able to try to capture elements of it in its multifaceted, multi-layered, multi-dimensional character, and not to simplify this rich ensemble of human practical activities, but also not to collapse into particularities. To be searching for the way in which there is a living unity. I mean, what Himani was just saying about an individual biography, that is to say that it's always in motion and never closed, but at the same time, it is always unitary for the individual, even though it's not closed, by which I mean it's not segmented. It's not, it's lived as an ensemble, and our lives are multidimensional, which is, I think, Himani, what you were saying about identity earlier. It's not that we don't work with identities, it's simply that they're not as fixed and reified as certain theorizations of them suggest. And that's what I mean by saying that to really stay at the level of practical human activity, is deeply challenging. And to me, a lot of what Himani's work does is to give us models of how to work and to think and to theorize at that level without making conceptual constructions the priority. It's not giving an a priori status to inherited concepts so much as working through and figuring out which concepts actually illuminate the concrete, which ones give us ways of deciphering. Himani, as some of you will know, loves mysteries and detective stories. And a lot of the art of detection is figuring out what unifies, links together, and connects seemingly random elements so that one can actually begin to unravel a logic of activity, a logic of praxis. And all of that, as I say, has to be done with enormous care. And so when you read Himani's case studies, and many of them, whether they're court cases or literary figures or poems or texts by Marx or problems like race and gender, there are always these concrete case studies through which we're opening up the social whole. And as I say, that priority of practical human activity seems to me to be something that is exemplary in Himani's work. And I really felt I wanted to highlight that for all of our viewers today. Himani, I want to turn it back over to you for any final words, and then I've got a few announcements and thanks to give at the end. But if you have any sort of concluding comments that you would like to share with us, your friends and comrades, or with our view.
Well, one thing from Marx, really, when we talk about he talks about activities, practical and human, he emphasizes the word sensuous. And I think the sensuous with all our five senses, the alertness of all our bodies and minds, and all the senses in their heightened sense, also must not be lost sight of. And I think that these activities, they are practical, but they're also, their complexity comes from their being a sensuous thing. Because our eyes, our ears, our skin and everything is acting all at once when we're hearing or seeing or feeling something. I don't know how else to talk about it. You're right. We can only be it in any given moment. And we know history is in that being, but we don't know how to really put it in words. So maybe words are in the end very limited.
Words may be limited, but nevertheless, we have this very big, overpowering, but also really a volume to be treasured, the Ideological Condition, selected essays on history, race, and gender by Himani Bannerji. I want to thank both of Himani's interlocutors, Judy Whitehead and Kanishka Gunawardena. Wonderful contributions helping us illuminate different aspects of this project of an anti-racist feminist Marxism that Himani has been engaged in over the decades. I want to thank Historical Materialism. Once again, our premier journal for critical Marxist research is giving us platforms for investigating and discussing really crucial contributions to historical materialism today. And I want to thank all the editors and organizers, Paul Reynolds in particular, for the heavy lifting that he has done for this session and for many others. A reminder, I am holding up the hardback edition from Brill in the Haymarket, in the Historical Materialism book series, but there is a paperback version, the beautiful cover design by David Mabb, out now with Haymarket Books, and it is 40% off right now. So now's the time to grab this wonderful volume. Finally, I want to thank the author herself. Himani Bannerji has given us a gift with this book, and you will have picked up her generosity of spirit and her solidarity sensibility throughout this conversation. Himani writes for us as part of an act of solidarity, a way of trying to think through and make sense together. And it is a total treasure to have all of these essays and articles and book chapters brought together in a single place after 35 years plus of doing this work of thinking and writing. So it's a gift. And on behalf of all of us, I want to thank you, Himani. It's a treasure. And it's the kind of thing that so many of us will be dipping in and out of, returning to over and over again. It's just a major contribution to critical Marxist research and to the development, extension, and growth of historical materialism. And for that, we are all in your debt. And I want to thank you. I want to thank Kanishka and Judy again. I want to thank Historical Materialism and Haymarket Books, and thank as well everybody who tuned in to participate in this session with us today. Maybe we can all give some waves as we head out, and we hope to see everyone again and hope that you'll enjoy further sessions in Historical Materialism Online.
Yeah, thank you, David, too.
Thank you, David. Yes, for putting the book together.
Yes.